I am Dracula.
For years now, we have been gifted with movies that send shivers down our spines and that make us fear the unknown. These unsettling movies are designed to frighten, panic, provoke dread, alarm us, and also invoke our darkest fears. The beginning of the horror genre began during the 1930s thanks to Universal Studios. During the early period of talking pictures, Universal Pictures began a successful gothic horror film series. They were movies such as Dracula in 1931, Frankenstein in 1931, and The Old Dark House in 1932. Then it developed into films that blended science fiction into the gothic horror. For example, The Invisible Man in 1933. Universal's horror cycle continued into the 1940s with low-budget movies including The Wolfman in 1941, as well as a number of films that created some of the most common monsters. Other studios then began to follow Universal's lead, with MGM creating the controversial film Freaks in 1932. Moving on to the 1950s to the 1960s, advances in technology changed the tone of horror and most of the film shifted from gothic towards contemporary concerns. Two subgenres began to emerge within these time periods, which were doomsday and demonic. Low-budget productions featured humanity overcoming threats such as alien invasions and deadly mutations to people, plants and insects. Hollywood directors and producers found ample opportunity for audience exploitation through the use of gimmicks. House of Wax in 1953 used 3D film to draw audiences, whilst The Tingle in 1959 used electric seat buzzers. During the late 1950s, Great Britain emerged as a producer of horror films. The Hammer Company focused on the genre for the first time, enjoying huge international success from films involving classic horror characters, which were shown in colour for the first time. This leads us on to the 70s, 80s and 90s. The financial successes of low-budget gore films of the ensuing years led to the release of more films with the occult themes during the 1970s. The Exorcist in 1973 was the first of these movies and was a significant commercial success, which meant that many horror films followed the surrounding idea of a demon entity. The 70s mostly focused on reincarnation and demons. A lot of different subgenres were developed over these 3 decades.
The Rocky Horror Picture Show.
A cycle of slasher films was made during the 1970s and early 1980s. John Carpenter created Halloween in 1978, Sean Cunningham made Friday the 13th in 1980, Wes Craven directed A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984, and Clive Barker made Hellraiser in 1987. The 1980s saw a wave of gory low-budget, also referred to as B-movies, horror films. Although most of them were criticised, many became cult classics and later saw success among critics. A later significant example is Sam Raimi's Evil Dead movies, which were low-budget gore fests but had a very original plotline, which was later praised by critics. Other horror film examples included the cult vampire classic Fright Night in 1985 and The Lost Boys in 1987, along with the Gremlins and the Poltergeist series. To reconnect us as an audience, horror became more self-mockingly iconic, especially in the latter half of the 1990s. Wes Craven's Scream movies, starting in 1996, featured teenagers who were fully aware and often made references to the history of horror movies and mixed ironic humour with the shocks.
And number 3, never, ever, ever under any circumstances say, "I'll be right back," because you won't be back.
Get another beer, you want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back!
Horror films' evolution throughout the years has given society a new approach to resourcefully utilise their benefits. The horror film style has changed over time, but in 1996, Scream set off a chain of copycats, leading to a new variety of teenage horror movies. This new approach to horror films began to gradually earn more and more revenue, as seen in the progress of the Scream movies. The first movie earned $6 million, and the third movie earned $101 million. The importance that horror films have gained in the public and producer's eye is one of obvious effect on our society. Early horror films such as My Bloody Valentine in 1981, Halloween in 1978, and Friday the 13th in 1980 were mostly produced for male audiences in order to feed the fantasies of young men. This idea is no longer prevalent in horror films, as women have become not only the main audience and fans of horror film, but also the main protagonists of contemporary horror films. The start of the 2000s saw a quiet period for the genre, only having a few releases such as Jason X in 2001 and Freddy vs. Jason in 2003. Final Destination in 2001 marked a successful revival of teen-centred horror. Films such as Orphan, Wrong Turn, Cabin Fever and the previously mentioned films helped bring the genre back to restricted ratings in theatres. There had been a major return to the zombie genre in horror movies during the 2000s. The Resident Evil video game franchise was adapted into a film and was released in March of 2002. As of March 2015, a fifth sequel is in development. Also following the zombie subgenre of horror, films such as I Am Legend in 2007, Quarantine in 2008 and Zombieland in 2009. The large trend of extreme graphic violence that characterised much of the low-budget exploitation of horror extended out to horror that focused on depictions of torture, suffering and violent deaths. These are films such as Ghost Ship in 2002 and Eight-Legged Freaks also in 2002. The Collector, Saw, Hostel and their respective sequels are frequently singled out as examples of this subgenre. Finally, with the arrival of Paranormal Activity in 2009 following the stylings of the Blair Witch Project, it was well received among critics and had an excellent reception at the box office. Remakes of earlier horror movies became routine in the 2000s, starting with the 2004 remake Dawn of the Dead. The film that helped the reimagining of movies was Halloween. Horror films' income expansion is the only first sign of influences of horror flicks. The role of women and how women see themselves in the movie industry has been altered by the horror genre. This leads us on to some statistics. In the UK, statistics found that 36% of the male population under 35 like horror movies, but 44% of women under 35 like horror movies more. The late 70s and early 1980s had a big impact on the horror industry. Video nasties is a term used in the UK that refers to a number of films distributed on video cassette that were criticised for their violent content by the press, social commentators and various religious organisations. As a result of this, after the 1984 Videos Recording Act was passed by Parliament, every video cassette or DVD intended for sale or rental in the UK had to be passed by the British Board of Film Classification, also known as the BBFC. During the period of 1984 to 1999, the board was at their least lenient and video nasties largely stayed banned or at least heavily edited, at least until the early part of the 21st century. Although this was all happening, you could still pick up bootleg copies of these films for the best part of 20 years. But now you can buy most of these said video nasties uncut in high street stores or through the internet. The whole thing doesn't seem to be a big deal anymore. Altogether, 72 titles appeared on the list at one point or another. 39 of these were successfully prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act, but subsequently some of these films were cut and then approved for release by the BBFC. The remaining 35 films were either not prosecuted or had unsuccessful prosecutions. Ultimately, the list became obsolete when the Videos Recording Act came into force in 2001. Several of the films have been released uncut. In the majority of cases, cuts were made to scenes that showed real-life animal cruelty and/or excessive violence to women, both of which are still regarded as severe by the BBFC. 11 of the films from the list are still banned in the UK because they have not been resubmitted for classification by any distributors or have been rejected for classification. 11 films from the list are still banned in the UK because they have not been yet resubmitted for classification by any distributors or have been rejected for classification. Now, what makes a good horror film? Well, there are many different factors that go into creating a decent horror film. Horror has a different meaning to everyone, and what one person may find scary, another may not. Horror is very personal. According to online sources, there are a few different factors that go into creating a good horror movie. This includes things like fear of death, the dark, creepy crawlies like spiders and snakes, scary places like graveyards and old houses, disfigurement like Frankenstein's monster, dismemberment, like loss of a limb, mostly seen in films like Saw, suspense, for example anticipation built up by the use of music, and fear of the unusual. Horror movies usually take something that's not scary but then turn it into an object of fear, for example things like dolls and animals.
I think my favourite horror movie is probably The Ring, because that was like one of the first horror movies I've ever seen, and I really liked the idea of like if you ring someone then you're gonna die in 7 days, and all the things leading up to it. It's a really good way to portray that.
My favourite horror movie is It Follows, because of the fact that it's about a sexually transmitted disease that gets passed on to someone, and then there's this creature that follows you around called It, and if it gets too close to you, you get killed, and for you to not die you have to pass it on to someone else. And I like that because it's kind of based on a real life situation, and where people do get sexually transmitted diseases but they can't get rid of them.
I think that the originality of modern horrors is kind of like lessened, because obviously when horror was new there was a whole bunch of ideas for it, whereas now they're doing more like sequels and remakes.
I think that modern horrors are so much more better because we got better quality equipment and then than what we did than what there was with the old horror films, because you just had like the basic cameras. There weren't much you could do to them. You couldn't really edit stuff into them like nowadays. You can use so much CGI, you can make stuff even more creepier and sort of kind of realistic, but with old horror movies you can't exactly do that.
I think that probably technology will have a bigger effect, because we're getting bigger with technology, and then like as technology grows I feel like they'll have to incorporate it more in horror so it can be more relatable to today.
I think that they will change more, because at the moment you got movies like Friend Request and Unfriended where they're all based on social media, and it's kind of realistic because of the fact that people get bullied through social media.
Honestly, that's a question that no one can really answer, because horror is inspired by cultural, social, like political and historical acts. So unless you can tell the future, you can't really tell what the genre is going to be like and how horror is going to change.
My favourite horror movie character is probably Ghostface, because of the way he uses the typical horror movie characteristics and codes and conventions and like flips them on his head, and the only reason he's killing is to stay within those codes and conventions.
I'd say Jigsaw, because the way he controlled the situations that he put his victims in, and he wasn't just doing it because he wanted to, he was doing it to teach his victims a lesson, and that is, he had purpose to what he was doing, and he wasn't just going around stabbing people, and I thought that was pretty clever as a plot line for 5-6 movies.
So mine is Freddy Krueger because he's funny, and it's really weird how his way of attacking someone suffers through your nightmares, and it shows that some people, like when you have nightmares, like it does scare you, and for it to do it that way makes you even more frightened, and it also stops you from kind of sleeping, because you might end up thinking that he might come through your dreams and kill you.
I think that old horror characters, especially like the first generation of horror characters, are really outdated because they're obviously like really exaggerated to make their points and stuff. Whereas like newer horror characters like Samara from The Ring and like Ghostface are more sadistic, and they seem scarier in modern days. I think that certain horror movie remakes, like the ones who are like Dracula and Frankenstein being remade, is a good thing, because they're like really comical now, as they're quite outdated and all the effects and stuff aren't really that good. But horror movie remakes from movies like the 80s, like Nightmare on Elm Street, and that, although they have a better pixelated image, the idea is pretty much the same, and the acting wasn't that bad back in the 80s, so it doesn't really make much sense to remake them at this point in time.
Yeah, I was saying, as long as they're done properly, then yeah, they're really good. But some characters just can't be lived up to. Like, I've heard from a lot of people that the Poltergeist remake wasn't as good as the original one. Personally, I thought it was quite good. But other movies have been quite a disappointment to fans of.
They're quite crap actually, such as Carrie, because they did the remake, I think it was in 2014, and it was really, really bad. And also such as A Nightmare on Elm Street, the one that came out in 2010, it was like a remake of the very first Nightmare on Elm Street that was made in 1984, and it just wasn't as good as that one. So I think they should stop as well, because it gets kind of boring as well. You've seen the same stuff constantly.
I think personally horror movies don't affect my behaviour because I've always grown up knowing like what's right and wrong and what's socially acceptable in society.
Horror movies definitely affect your behaviour in a social aspect. In a social aspect, yeah. Like if a child is watching a violent movie, such as let's say Saw, then they might get interested in how they would react to maybe stabbing someone in the face.
It really depends on how far you want to take horror movies. I don't really think it affects a large amount of people. There will be certain people who will go really stupid, such as a guy in America decided to get to copy a torture chamber from one of the Saw films, and he's actually killed quite a few people who he's captured.
I think technology has influenced horror quite a lot as it grows in popularity, like new technologies being introduced, so then to make horror movies more relatable to our lives and to make it scarier, I think they feel like they need to include more technology, which explains unfriended and friend requests.
It's influenced it a lot because of the fact that now we've got more better equipment than what we did in the olden days, like I said. Where like in the 1930s they didn't have much stuff to use. Like nowadays you can use like CGI, green screen, stuff like that to help influence. But in the future they will be developing more stuff to improve more of the characters, to make them a little bit more realistic.
I think horror will always reflect the concerns of the populace of the time. So if you look at the 1950s, you've got giant monsters, you've got fear of radiation, you've got all of these sorts of things which are a direct result of the atom bomb. And that feeds through into the culture. It normally takes a little while, but then horror takes these ideas and explores them. So and that kind of goes on. That's been the case all the way along. I think that the advent of 9/11 changed horror for a while. I certainly think that the fear of the other, the fear of whether it be people of different nationalities, whether it be people with different agendas, people with different, any of these sorts of things, all fed into movies like Hostel and stuff like that, which wasn't, I don't think, a particularly pleasant or forward-looking moment for the genre, but it was reflecting the concerns of the people at the time. But I think that horror will always have that central thread of reflecting back at society the things that it's worried about. I feel over the next 20 years, as the means of watching movies change, I think that horror is likely to embrace VR and immersion and possibly crossbreed with games.
We then exchanged emails with a director and screenwriter named Oliver Park. He made his first short horror film called Vicious in 2015. Vicious won 10 awards and it was nominated for a further 8 awards. It got critical acclaim in all its reviews and reached over 100,000 views in 1 month on YouTube. He says that many of his ideas are taken from his nightmares. Then, when he discovered horror films, he quickly fell in love with films by Carpenter, Craven, Kubrick, Romero, Cronenberg, Russell, Barker and Hitchcock. Oliver claims that he once heard someone say, "A good horror film leaves a stone in your shoe after you leave the cinema. It stays with you and leaves you uncomfortable." He loves the idea of that, but it's not enough. He wants to fill your shoes with stones and stitch barbed wire to your bed. As for horror progression from the 1930s, Oliver thinks that there is a natural creepiness to horror films from that time. But dated films can usually be a bad thing, but with horror it seems to work. As for horror developing over the next 20 years, he feels that gore will fade, as there's been quite a lot lately. He feels that CGI is getting better and audience are demanding more realistic effects and stories, and it will be interesting to see where these will go. There are amazing new horror directors appearing at the moment, and he for one is excited to see what they will do. Speaking in terms of present day horror, he feels that there's a lot of personal taste that goes into horror films, but they seem to be getting harsher reviews by the day. Horror films seem to target specific types of horror or scare. Looking from an outsider's perspective, he feels that studios seem more inclined to give the audience what they want, which is mainly scares. But indie films don't pander to those wishes. They're not afraid to take chances and be totally unique. This means that an audience has no idea where the film is going to go and therefore are more likely to be uncomfortable. We then spoke to Mark Cartwright, the owner of Glass Cannon Films, a film production company based in Los Angeles. They released a short horror film called Sloven. The influences for his film explore people and their relationship with reality. When he was thinking about his film, he watched a few Alfred Hitchcock movies and wanted to make something that took a normal situation but added a creepy element. Mark's opinion on what makes a good horror film is not just relying on sex and gore. He likes films that make you think a little, take a normal situation and add a creepy factor to it. He thinks that a good horror film plays on the fears and insecurities of its current audience. He feels that horror has progressed since the 1930s in the form of technology and the subject matter. He believes that our horror discusses the fears of its audience it's made for, and those fears have changed throughout time. Our society is concerned with different things that it may have been in the 30s. Mark believes that over the next 20 years, horror films will discuss fears about technology, for example, computers being more integrated into our society, people becoming more detached through being on their phones and computers. In conclusion, the genre of horror has vastly developed over the last 80 or so years. Things such as the development of special effects, filming technology, and different factors have really affected the genre as a whole, and there are still a lot more things that could be done within the genre of horror.